Welcome, dear listener. Whenever you may be joining us, whether it's in the quiet hour before sleep, in the middle of a restless night, or as morning gently begins to rise, we invite you to let go, settle in, and drift into the distant hum of forgotten time. If you'd like, you can comment below and share. At what time are you watching this video? You are listening now to your narrator, Historian Couch, and together, we'll take a long, peaceful journey through the myths, memories, and daily rhythms of ancient Greece. We won't chase battles or hunt monsters tonight. No fiery chariots, no thunderbolts, just soft sandals on sun-warmed stone. The rustle of robes, the scent of myrrh in temple halls, and the stories people told when the sky turned gold and the fires burned low. This is not the Greece of sudden violence or heroic shouts. This is the Greece that whispered to itself, slowly, calmly, faithfully, where gods were imagined not with fear, but familiarity, and where their lives, as strange and immortal as they may seem, still reflected the slow, earthy, utterly human concerns of those who shaped them. So now, make yourself comfortable. Plug in your earphones. Keep the distractions away. Let your limbs grow heavy, your breath fall into rhythm, and allow your thoughts to wander gently into the olive groves. There is no rush. No need to remember it all. Simply drift. And if you happen to fall asleep, that is more than welcome. Our first segment begins not on Mount Olympus, but in the shadowed streets and smoky kitchens of the mortal world, with the soft, curious question, what did it feel like to live among the stories of the gods? There was a hush to the mornings in ancient Greece. Not because people whispered, but because everything moved slowly, especially in the smaller towns that clung to the hillsides or basked in low river valleys. The sound of sandals brushing dust was the first music of the day. Doors opened to courtyards still cool from the night, and the sky, pale and clear, cast long, sleepy shadows across whitewashed stone. Most homes were simple, 2 rooms, maybe 3. A courtyard at the center, where an olive jar waited beside a worn stool. The hearth smoked softly. Bread, already half-baked by dawn, cooled on woven mats. Above it all, the gods watched, not in fearsome silence, but as part of the background. Shrines weren't elaborate. They were modest. A small clay figure here, a sprig of bay leaves there. A little honey dripped into a dish, left by the door, not because someone demanded it, but because it had always been that way. Even in their quietest hours, the people did not feel alone. There was always something divine in the dust. In every corner of daily life, there was a god's name softly folded into the action. To knead the dough was to think of Demeter. To fill a jar with wine was to nod toward Dionysus, even if only in thought. The meals were plain: barley bread, dried figs, a handful of olives cured in brine. But they were honored, not hurried. The morning meal was quiet and small, a little bread dipped in watered wine, maybe a smear of cheese if the goat had been generous. But at night, when the day was done and the tools had been laid aside, the meal turned almost sacred. The family sat low on woven mats. The lamp flickered. Bread was torn, not sliced. Lentils bubbled slowly in terracotta pots, heavy with garlic and crushed coriander. And in the background, always, the little altar glowed faintly with a bit of oil, a warm reminder that food was a gift. and meals were soft ceremonies in themselves. They didn't speak the gods' names loudly, but they tasted them in every bite. Clothing in the ancient Greek world was not sewn, but draped. Lengths of wool or linen, folded and tied in careful pleats and knots. There was no needle rushing along seams, no scissors slicing through patterns, only soft, steady weaving, and the patient hum of work that took days, weeks, months. The loom stood in the corner of many homes, tall and quiet, like a patient guardian. Its threads were stretched taut, like sunbeams caught in a net. Women passed the shuttle back and forth, over and under, while the youngest children played with scraps at their feet. Wool smelled faintly of lanolin and smoke. Linen was cooler, crisper, bleached by sun. The colors were soft, faded ochres, plant-dyed greens, the occasional deep blue, if one was lucky. And each thread, it was said, moved beneath Athena's gaze, the goddess of wisdom, but also of craft. To weave was not simply to make something warm. It was to participate in something ancient, to touch the same rhythm, the same steady motion that stretched back through mothers and daughters, to stories older than stone. The roads were not grand. They wound like goat paths, worn smooth by years of soft sandals and wooden carts. People walked slowly. No one rushed, unless it was to avoid the noonday sun or the sudden flash of a summer storm. Along these paths, markers stood, not signs, but little stacked stones, or worn marble slabs carved with faint prayers. Children skipped past them without thinking. Elders paused, placed a hand upon them, and muttered a few words to Hermes, god of travelers. The market smelled of olives and clay. Figs lay in woven baskets. Oil glistened in tall-necked jars. Merchants called out softly, not shouting, but repeating, like waves lapping at the shore. Coins clinked. Hands gestured. Goods changed owners. And the sky remained warm, watchful, unbothered. Even errands, even purchases, were acts of ritual. Homes were not loud. Life was not quiet. There was always a hum. Chickens in the courtyard, the whir of a spinning spindle. Water sloshing in a jug. Children giggling, then whispering. In between, silence stretched like thread, thin, golden, and unbroken. People listened, not just to each other, but to the air, for omens, for changes, for stories. A crow's caw at dusk, a breeze through the laurel, a clay pot breaking by accident. The gods were not above the clouds. They were in these details, in the pattern of dust across the floor, in the flicker of light through a lattice. This was not superstition. It was a rhythm, a lullaby the world sang to itself. As the sky faded into deep purples and soft black, homes grew still, the air cooled, lamps burned low, and the day's final gestures, a bowl rinsed, a door secured, were performed with slow familiarity. Sleep came differently than today. No feathered beds, no private chambers with doors. Families slept close, on mats, on woven pallets, on straw filled with dried herbs, the floor beneath them cool, the ceiling above gently creaking. In sleep, the boundaries between mortal and divine grew thin. Dreams were not dismissed. They were watched for signs. A snake in a dream might be a god's messenger. A sudden vision of fire could foretell harvest. The priests of Asclepios, god of healing, believed in sacred dreams where cures and before silence, there were stories. A grandfather might hum a few lines of a hymn to Apollo. A mother might tell a child how Athena spun a storm into the sea. Sometimes the tales were short and quiet, about a golden apple or a jealous god, and sometimes they stretched long into the dark, full of wandering heroes and whispering nymphs. They were not read aloud from scrolls. Most people never held one. They were spoken, like lullabies or remembered recipes. In the pause between words, children drifted into sleep, not with fear, but with curiosity. The myths did not feel far away. They were folded into everyday life, like salt into dough, soft, ever-present, and inherited. Children were closer to the gods, some believed. Their words stumbled, their eyes widened, and their minds were not yet too full of reason. So they were watched with gentle caution, their games, their drawings, their dreams. It was not taught like a lesson. It was simply lived. Not all worship took place in temples. Not every prayer echoed beneath marble columns. More often, it was a gesture, a pinch of flour, a slice of fruit, a few drops of oil warmed in a copper spoon, an offering left at a small shelf near the hearth, or at a stone tucked behind the house where ivy grew. Even those who had little gave something, not because they feared the gods, but because they respected them. The gods were everywhere, and thus worship could be anywhere. A woman whispered to Hera as she spun wool for her daughter's dowry. A farmer nodded toward Zeus before sowing seeds. A sailor tied a bit of blue ribbon around his wrist before a voyage, murmuring Poseidon's name into the breeze. It wasn't spectacle. It was rhythm, a heartbeat of belief. In the end, daily life moved like a slow, patient procession, from sun to shade, from birth to rest, always beneath the gaze of Olympus. But that gaze wasn't harsh. The gods were not always angry. They could be amused, curious, silent, forgetful. And people lived with them not in constant fear, but in gentle awareness, like living with weather, with the sea, with the moon's changing face, not distant rulers, but eternal neighbors. At the center of every home was a hearth, and at the heart of every hearth, a flicker. It wasn't dramatic, it wasn't loud, but it was everything. Because where the hearth burned, so too did life. And wherever warmth lived, so did she. Temples rose slowly, not with haste, but with the patience of generations. They were made of marble and wood, yes, but also of silence, of longing, of accumulated footsteps. Inside, it was always cooler, always still. Light filtered through high doorways. Dust swirled like incense. And at the end, the statue, vast or small, clothed in gold or paint or simple clay. It wasn't meant to be seen often. People didn't enter temples casually. They approached softly, offerings in hand, words already formed in their mouths. They did not expect the gods to speak back. It was enough to stand close. Not all rituals were hushed. Sometimes the gods were honored with sound, color, and procession. Drums, flutes, dancers in long robes, offerings carried through the streets on woven trays, statues veiled in garlands of poppy and laurel. Children watched, wide-eyed. Elders whispered the stories of the first festival, the oldest rites. Dancers circled, priests chanted, wine flowed. But even in joy, there was rhythm. Even in celebration, reverence. These were not merely parties. They were moments when the divine walked among them, massed, sung to, carried high. And in the laughter, the footsteps, the scent of roasted lamb, the people remembered their place within the story. Sometimes belief required movement, a journey, a climb, a crossing. Pilgrims walked alone or in small groups, winding along dusty roads toward distant temples. To Delphi, to Eleusis, to Dodona, they carried little, a pouch of olives, a wineskin, a sprig of laurel to offer. The road itself was sacred. Each step a kind of prayer. At night, they rested beneath fig trees or in shared shelters. They whispered thanks to Hermes for safe passage. And when at last they arrived, they did not rush. They knelt. They listened. They left what they could, and they returned lighter. Beyond the Olympians, there were smaller presences, lesser gods, local spirits, daemons of doorways and wells. They weren't feared, they were acknowledged. With a bow of the head, a muttered phrase, a coin tucked into a crack in the wall. In the countryside, it was said dryads lived in trees, and river gods in the current. In homes, small figures guarded cupboards, thresholds, and gates. No grand rituals were needed. Just awareness. Just the habit of noticing. Even silence could be worship. Weather, in the ancient world, was not a pattern. It was a message. Thunder wasn't only sound. It was Zeus speaking. A sudden breeze in the olive grove might be a nymph passing close. The rising of fog on a summer morning felt like a veil pulled gently between mortals and the divine. No one argued with the wind. They listened. They watched the sky, just as their grandparents had. They learned the feel of a storm coming. They knew the scent of wet stone before the first drop of rain. And when lightning cracked the heavens, no one pointed, they bowed. Because the gods, after all, had their moods too. Daily life was full of signs. A bird crossing from left to right, a sudden cough at the moment of decision, the breaking of pottery just before a guest arrived. People didn't panic. They paused. They waited, watched, adjusted. Superstition wasn't fear. It was a kind of courtesy, a way of acknowledging that the world might be trying to speak, and perhaps, just perhaps, one should listen. Charms were kept near doorways. Herbs were tied in bundles. Salt scattered with intention. And all of it was done gently, without rush, without question. It was simply part of living. In the soft curve of village life, nothing went unnoticed. The way a man offered thanks at the shrine, the bread a woman baked for her neighbor, the way someone looked at the sky, or walked too quickly past the temple without bowing. The gods might be watching. As evening arrived, the light changed. Not just dimmed, changed. It passed through lattice work, turned orange gold, and wrapped itself around columns and doorways. The sound of goats faded. The streets quieted. Fires were lit not only for warmth, but for reassurance. Twilight was not just the end of a day. It was a moment between. The boundary between sun and moon. Between noise and stillness. Between the realm of mortals and that of dreams. Many believed it was the hour the gods passed unseen, observing gently before night claimed the land. A liminal space, a breath held, then exhaled. Each day in the ancient world may seem simple to us, but to those who lived it, it was full of meaning, gesture, pattern, and slow comfort. Wake, warm bread, greet the gods, spin the wool, whisper to the wind, break the bread, share a story, tend the fire, offer a fig, walk the road, dream again. A loop, a litany, a lullaby. The rhythm of their lives was not rushed. It moved with the earth, with the sea, with the sky. And in that rhythm, the gods were not distant. They were woven in, as soft and steady as the wind in the trees. Long before Olympus stood high above the clouds, there was stillness. Not nothing, but not quite something either. A gentle chaos, a thick, velvety silence. The Greeks called it chaos. Not loud, not violent, simply unformed. And from this ancient hush came Gaia, the earth herself, and then the sky, Uranus. They did not roar into being. They simply emerged, like morning mist. The early gods were vast and distant, less like people, more like natural law. Gaia gave birth to the mountains, the sea, the deep places of the world. Uranus stretched above, watching, unmoving. This was a time when gods were elements, not emotions. Time itself, Chronos, was born in this age, and with him, the slow beginning of story. The world was not yet awake, but it had begun to dream. Chronos, son of the sky and earth, ruled not with cruelty, but with careful suspicion. He had heard a prophecy, soft as a breeze, yet heavy with fate, that one of his children would replace him. Chronos, son of the sky and earth, ruled not with cruelty, but with careful suspicion. He had heard a prophecy, soft as a breeze, yet heavy with fate, that one of his children would replace him. And so, one by one, he swallowed them, not in rage, in fear. This was not a tale of blood and screams. It was about control, about time trying to stop time. But Gaia, patient as stone, whispered a plan, and Rhea, Kronos' sister and wife, moved with silent resolve. She wrapped a stone in cloth and passed it to Kronos. And while he slept, she hid her child, the last one, far away. His name was Zeus, and thus began the slow shifting of power, not with a shout, but with a whisper. Zeus did not rise in anger. He grew slowly, under care, hidden in a cave on Crete, where bees made honey and nymphs sang lullabies to keep him calm. The goats fed him, the forest protected him. He listened to the rustling of olive trees and the songs of flowing springs. When he was ready, he did not rage. He returned with patience, guided by his mother and the old earth herself. He freed his swallowed siblings, Hestia, Demeter, Hera, Hades, and Poseidon. And together they formed something new. They did not erase the old gods. They folded them into memory. And on Mount Olympus, the new order began. High above, yet never fully apart from those who whispered their names. The Olympians were not perfect. They were not all-powerful, nor always wise, but they were deeply known. There was Hera, seated in stillness, a crown of lilies in her hair, watching with the weariness of one who remembers every promise ever broken. Poseidon, the sea in his bones, but often quiet inland, known more by the smell of salt than the crash of waves. Demeter, whose hands smelled of grain, who cried only when the soil stopped listening. Athena, born from thought, not warlike, but measured, her wisdom as soft as parchment. Apollo and Artemis, twin lights in different hues. Aphrodite, who rarely needed to speak to be heard. Ares, whose anger was more of an ache. Hephaestus, who worked through pain slowly and skillfully. Hermes, who walked with dust on his feet and secrets in his smile. Dionysus, always half asleep, half divine, the god of slow forgetfulness. And Zeus, not the thunderbolt, but the silence before it, watching, waiting. Each had temples, each had festivals, but their true temples were the minds of those who remembered them. Olympus was not a place of fire and glory. It was a mountaintop wrapped in cloud. The winds quieted as they rose toward it. The sun, when it touched the marble, did so gently. The gods lived there not in constant quarrel, but in slow ritual, sharing nectar, watching the world below, whispering among themselves, planning, sometimes, forgetting, often. There were no walls, no gates, only the hush of altitude and the press of immortality. And the gods, for all their power, seemed strangely human in their slowness, their pettiness, their affections, their longing. They were not above, they were beside, just beyond the veil of the everyday. Hera was not simply the goddess of marriage. She was the keeper of vows, and vows, like threads, fray slowly, not with violence, but with time. She remembered every slight, every deception, every flower gifted to another. But she did not rage each time. Not always. Sometimes, when the wheat stopped growing, people didn't blame the soil. They whispered Demeter's name. She was not only the goddess of harvest, she was the one who mourned. And through her mourning, the world was taught patience. When her daughter, Persephone, vanished into the shadowed realm, Demeter did not scream. She searched. She walked for days through fields and hills, asking stones and rivers if they had seen the girl. The world withered gently as she walked, and when Persephone returned, even briefly, life stirred again. Not all at once, but slowly. Far from the halls of Olympus, Hephaestus worked. He did not join the feasts often. His hands were dark with soot, his steps slow, but his fires never went out, glowing quietly in caves and beneath mountains. He shaped thunderbolts, yes, but also cups, pins, delicate hinges for temple doors. He was not only a smith of weapons, but of the small mechanisms that made the world function. The gods rarely thanked him, but they used what he made. His story was one of injury and exile, of being cast from Olympus and finding his place anyway, not by force, but by craft. Hephaestus taught that usefulness could be its own kind of beauty. Pan did not live on Olympus. He wandered the hills, half forgotten, half animal, and always listening. The rustling of leaves, the hum of bees, the hollow echo of a flute on the wind. This was his worship. He made no demands. He offered no judgments. And yet, He was feared, not for cruelty, but for surprise. A sudden sound in the woods was called panic, a reminder of his wild presence. But even this fear was natural, not malicious. Like a startled deer, like thunder heard from far away, Pan reminded mortals that the divine was not always distant. Sometimes it crouched behind a tree, watching, and then it was gone. Artemis moved through the forest without a sound. She was the goddess of the hunt, yes, but also of stillness, of breath held. And though she was never truly close, her presence was always felt, in moonlight caught on water, in footprints that disappeared before they could be followed. Hermes was not grand like Zeus, nor feared like Hades. He was the god who passed by. His sandals bore wings, not for flight, but for swiftness, and yet he rarely rushed. He walked along ridges, through markets, over riverbanks. He spoke to merchants and ghosts alike. He carried messages, yes, but he also carried comfort. A coin placed under the tongue of the dead was for him, so he could guide them gently, wordlessly, to the quieter realm beyond. He played the lyre. He stole in jest. He laughed, but never cruelly. To follow Hermes was to walk a winding road, but never alone. Dionysus was not just wine. He was forgetting. Not the sharp kind, but the slow easing of control. The way a song takes over the feet. The way laughter comes without being summoned. He arrived in garlands and smoke, in torchlight and rhythm. But he was not always welcome. He blurred things, gender, thought, identity, even godhood. He was mortal once, or half, and still he reached Olympus not by thunder, but by insistence. His followers danced barefoot. His temples were forests. His truths were not spoken, but felt. He did not demand belief, only surrender. Athena was not born. She emerged, fully formed, from Zeus's own thoughts, clad in armor, yet rarely at war. Her weapon was clarity. Her power was restraint. Her gift was reason. She taught mortals to spin, to build, to govern, not by command, but through example. The owl watched silently from her shoulder, not as a symbol of fear, but of careful observation. Her temples were orderly. Her worshippers walked with heads slightly bowed, not in shame, but in deep thought. When she appeared in dreams, she rarely spoke. She simply pointed and let the sleeper choose the path. Apollo's voice was music, not the loud kind, but the soft repetition of a lyre string at dawn. He was the god of light, but not fire. He illuminated, he did not burn. He saw things clearly, too clearly sometimes. His prophecies were gifts and burdens. His temples, like Delphi, pulsed not with noise, but with quiet waiting. People did not shout in his presence. They listened. He was not always kind, but always balanced. His songs healed and hurt alike. And in the golden air of morning, as the first rays touched the sea, he was there, seen, not heard. Sometimes the gods walked in human form, not with grand entrances, but like travelers. Dust on their robes, silence in their steps, a beggar asking for bread, a stranger sleeping near a temple gate, mortals who offered kindness were often rewarded, not with gold, but with protection, with dreams that brought peace, with vines that bore fruit longer than they should have. The gods, after all, watched closely, but never obviously. Their presence lingered not in thunder, but in stillness, in chance meetings, in stories passed from grandmother to child. A shared meal, a whispered name, a hand extended without knowing why. She had been picking flowers. That's how most of the stories begin, not with a scream, but with sunlight and blossoms. Persephone, daughter of Demeter, surrounded by light, before the ground opened beneath her feet. Hades did not drag her down in fire. He appeared like a shadow, certain, still, inevitable. The earth closed quietly behind them, and spring held its breath. Below, she did not cry out. She sat. She listened. Time passed differently there, like fog rolling over the hills. Slow, without weight. And above, her mother wandered. The world cooled. Crops failed. Hope faded. Until a deal was made. A compromise of sorts. For part of the year, she would return. And with her, warmth, color, and life. But for the other, the world would sleep, as she did. Not a punishment, a pattern. There was a wedding, and one guest left uninvited. Eris, the spirit of discord, tossed a golden apple among the gathering, inscribed with a simple phrase, "To the fairest." It could have ended there, but it did not. Hera, Athena, and Aphrodite stood waiting, not fighting, just watching. Hera promised power. Athena offered wisdom. Aphrodite spoke of love. Paris chose beauty. And with that soft decision, that apple held too long in a trembling hand, began a chain of events that would lead to Troy. But on that day, it was just a gift, just a choice, just a breath. The city of Troy was not built in haste. Its walls were sung into place, some say, by gods in disguise. Apollo with his golden lyre, Poseidon with steady hands. They labored like mortals, stone by stone, under the sun. The people watched, unsure. The music rose in the evening air. The foundations were not just strong, they were sacred. But when payment was denied, a silent grudge took root. Not shouted, not pursued, simply remembered. The gods rarely forgot, and Troy stood tall, proud, and faded. Its beauty sealed its future. But in that moment, under Apollo's song, it was only a city in the making. Quiet, marble, hopeful. Arachne's fingers moved like water. Fast, sure, elegant. She didn't boast loudly, only enough to be noticed, enough to draw Athena's gaze. The goddess came not in glory, but in plain robes. She challenged the girl, not with wrath, but with thread. They wove, side by side, two looms, two visions, one divine, one mortal. And when it was over, when Arachne's tapestry shimmered with undeniable beauty, Athena did not rage, she mourned. Arachne had reached too far, and so she was changed, not punished, but transformed into a spider, a weaver of endless thread, not cast down, simply altered. Orpheus did not storm the underworld. He descended gently, lyre in hand, voice soft and steady. He did not demand his beloved's return. He sang of her life, of his longing, of the way her name sounded in the quiet. Even the Furies wept. Hades and Persephone, moved by such sorrow-shaped music, agreed. Eurydice could follow him back, but only if he did not look back. And so he walked, step after step, through shadow, through silence. She followed, but silence grew heavy, and doubt, like a thread pulled loose, began to unravel his calm. He turned, and in that moment, she faded. Not in pain, not in anger, just away. And Orpheus, alone again, kept walking. The song never ended, it only softened. The great temples of ancient Greece were not always grand. Some were small, tucked beside hills, worn by wind and time. Columns once gleamed in the sun, painted not in pale marble, but in rich color. Ochre, indigo, red, like pomegranate seeds. Now they stand silent, but their silence speaks. Archaeologists bend low over shards, a fragment of a column here, a staircase worn by thousands of bare feet there. These are the quiet clues. Each temple had its own sound. The echo of sandals across stone, the rustle of robes during feast days, the soft murmur of supplicants asking nothing more than peace for a season. Some worshipped Zeus atop high mountains, others Demeter in low valleys. But always the gods were close, not seen but felt, as steady as stone, as fleeting as breath. Not far from Athens, nestled in still hills, lay Eleusis. This was no place of spectacle. It was a sanctuary of secrets. The Eleusinian mysteries, held in Demeter's name, were quiet rites of trance. No record remains of what was said. That was the point. Initiates walked a path by torchlight. They fasted. They wept. They entered darkness together and emerged slowly, reborn. The rite mirrored Persephone's descent and return. Life, death, and life again. Not explained, but felt. Archaeologists today find altars, cryptic inscriptions, half-burnt offerings, but not the words. The mystery was never meant to be told, only held. Delphi did not feel like a battlefield of prophecy. It was a place of waiting. Pilgrims came barefoot, dusty, heads bowed. They brought gifts, olives, coins, a lock of hair. They waited their turn to speak not to Apollo, but to his mouthpiece, the Pythia. She sat in a shaded chamber, inhaling sacred vapors, her voice distant, dreamlike. She did not shout. She spoke in fragments, soft riddles shaped like mist. Her answers changed lives. Even now, scholars brush dust from the temple floor. They find inscriptions. Know thyself. Noth. The stone remembers, even when the voice is gone. And still, the wind in Delphi feels like an answer. Myths were not confined to temples. They lived on clay. Greek vases, simple in shape but rich in story, carried gods into kitchens, markets, and weddings. A jug might show Dionysus riding a lion. A plate might bear Athena's owl. Children learned stories not from books, but from pots passed between hands. Painters dipped brushes into slip, a thin black clay, and with steady fingers, drew Achilles chasing Hector, Orpheus serenading trees, Artemis loosing her silent arrow. Each line held reverence, each curve a tale. These weren't just decorations, they were devotions. Pompeii is Roman, yes, but its roots trace back to Greece, and under its ash, we find echoes, small household shrines, miniature statues of gods, offerings of figs, bread, and honey in shallow bowls. Worship was not always grand. Sometimes it was a mother, lighting oil in thanks to Hera, a fisherman whispering to Poseidon, a traveler tucking a coin beneath a stone for Hermes. These gestures were not forgotten. They were simply paused. And when the earth cracked open centuries later, the gestures remained, frozen in time, soft reminders that belief lived in rooms, not just temples. Not all shrines were made of marble. Some were just stones beneath a tree, a spring that never dried, a hillside where lightning had once struck. To the ancient Greeks, landscape itself could be holy, not by proclamation, but by presence. They believed gods favored certain places. A quiet cave for Pan, a shaded grove sacred to Artemis, a stream where nymphs were said to sing. These places were not marked by grandeur, but by stillness. Even now, archaeologists find strange patterns of votive offerings in places without foundations. Scattered bones of doves, terracotta figurines, bits of jewelry, all left where the wind murmured a little differently. The gods were not always distant. Sometimes they were a rustle in the grass. Beyond the 12 Olympians, many smaller deities were worshipped quietly. There was Hecate, who ruled over thresholds and crossroads. People left offerings for her at three-way paths, meals on little plates, left for no one to see. There was Asclepius, god of healing. His temples were places of sleep. People lay on cool stone floors, hoping to dream of cures. And then there were the household gods. The Lares and Penates, figures so humble they were never named. They guarded hearths, watched over ovens, and listened to whispered thanks after every safe return. These gods were not feared. They were kept, carried in pockets, tucked behind doors. The ancient Greeks did not write down music the way they wrote words, but they played it, softly, often. In small gatherings, someone would pluck a lyre, 5 or 7 strings, gentle and clear. In festivals, they played the aulos, a twin-piped reed instrument with a haunting, breathy sound. It didn't shout, it wandered. Some music was for mourning, some for prayer, some for lulling children to sleep. In Delphi, hymns were carved into stone, not to be heard again, but to remember that they were once sung. Now, scholars trace them like faded footsteps, trying to hear what once floated on olive-scented air. While some Greek festivals were grand, filled with shouting and drums, others came gently. In winter, people celebrated Linnea, honoring Dionysus not with wildness, but with small plays, shared wine, and laughter close to the fire. In early spring, Thesmophoria honored Demeter and Persephone. Only women participated. They fasted, shared stories, and tended the earth in silence. It was not spectacle. It was memory. These were not tourist spectacles. They were rhythms, like planting, like waiting. Death was not feared. It was prepared for. When someone passed, their body was washed, wrapped, and laid out at home. The room was filled with oil lamps and hushed voices. Coins were placed on their eyes or lips, payment for Hermes, to guide them gently. Mourners sang low, steady laments. Women led the rites. Small statues of gods were placed near the feet. Sometimes a whisper was given to the body, a final message for the gods. Tombs held more than bones. They held stories painted on their sides, chariots, banquets, embraces, not to boast, but to remember. Death was not the end, only another crossing. Theater in ancient Greece was not merely entertainment, it was an offering. In great stone amphitheaters like the one at Epidaurus, stories were told not for applause, but for the gods, especially Dionysus. The actors wore masks, not to hide, but to become. Chorus voices rose not in frenzy, but in patterned calm. Even tragedies unfolded with grace. The deaths were symbolic, the pain universal, but softened through poetry. Aeschylus, Sophocles, Euripides. Their words still echo off the worn marble seats, as if waiting for another dusk performance. Another audience, sitting cross-legged with olives in hand, listening to the gods reimagined as men. No hero shouted, no villain cackled, only questions remained, gently asked, never fully answered. In villas across the ancient world, from Delphi to Delos, from Sicily to Syria, myths lived beneath the feet of those who walked on polished floors. Tiny colored stones were placed one by one to form figures. Heracles wrestling lions, Aphrodite rising from sea foam, Persephone being led through meadows. These mosaics did not demand attention. They simply existed, calm, colorful, constant. Sometimes they adorned bathhouses where steam softened their edges. Sometimes they lay hidden for centuries, under ash or earth, until slowly revealed again, a foot, a face, a god in repose. And still they remain, stories, sleeping. Some myths were told not in temples or books, but in walls, carved into columns, scratched into clay pots, written across a gate or inside a shrine. These were not declarations. They were reminders. Heracles was here. Apollo, protect my child. Aphrodite, grant me peace. Even graffiti in ancient cities reveals quiet worship. A fisherman thanking Poseidon. A merchant invoking Hermes for luck. The gods lived in ink, in stone, in brief moments of hope, fear, and gratitude. These weren't prayers shouted to the sky. They were whispers left behind. The first gods children met were not thunderous. They were drawn on clay figurines, told through lullabies, recalled in bedtime tales by candlelight. Hera's patience, Hermes' cleverness, the seasons that turned because a mother grieved. In simple lines, in broken rhythm, children learned about courage, kindness, and consequence. The gods were like stories with open ends, inviting dreams more than obedience. And as those children grew, the stories grew with them. From play to prayer, from temple visits to private vows, myths weren't lessons, they were companions, always nearby, always softly shaped. With time, the old temples crumbled, columns fell, fires dimmed, new beliefs rose, Christianity, empires, new gods. The Olympians were no longer worshipped, but they were never quite gone. They lingered in language, in marble busts placed in museums, in constellations still named for them, in the hush that falls over ruins just before dusk. Archaeologists walk slowly, gently brushing away dirt, piecing together forgotten offerings. Teachers still tell the stories, painters still draw their forms, and somewhere, someone lights a candle, not in faith, but in quiet wonder. Because myths do not vanish, they become part of the air. In the olive groves and grain fields of the Greek countryside, myth did not arrive on scrolls. It came with the seasons. A farmer rising before dawn might nod toward the sky, not in greeting, but in recognition. The morning mist was seen as a gift from Poseidon. The dry heat of noon, a sign that Apollo's chariot was high. Villagers did not build great temples. They stacked stones in quiet corners of the field. Hung wreaths of laurel from their doorways, whispered the names of Demeter or Artemis as they scattered seed. They didn't argue about the nature of gods. They lived alongside them. In the shaded colonnades of Athens, the philosophers walked slowly. They spoke in soft, questioning tones. What is justice? What is the soul? Are the gods real, or symbols of deeper truths? Plato, reclining beneath a fig tree, saw the divine as pure form, the perfection behind appearances. Aristotle believed in causes, purpose within nature itself. Still, they spoke of the gods, always with care. Even those who questioned belief still used myth to explain life. The tale of the cave, the charioteer of the soul. They did not discard the old stories. They reshaped them. The mind, too, worships, just differently. In the clatter of the potter's quarter, myth lived in motion. A sculptor carved Athena's eyes, not for a temple, but for a merchant's house. A weaver stitched Dionysus into a banquet tapestry. A blacksmith etched Hermes into a bronze mirror's back. Artisans rarely claimed wisdom. They had no time for theory, but their hands carried myth further than any philosopher's tongue. Their gods were not remote. They were patterned, painted, burned into glaze, chiseled into corners. The divine was not above them. It moved with them, in kilns, in dyes, in dust. Kings and tyrants invoked the gods with ceremony. Their thrones were flanked by eagles and laurels. Coins bore images of Zeus or Athena, not for piety, but for power. My lineage descends from Heracles, they might say, or Apollo favors this city. Myths were used not only to comfort the people, but to legitimize control. Yet rulers, too, made offerings, before a battle, at the birth of a child, in moments of doubt. For all their gold and marble, they still looked skyward. They still feared storms. And in the privacy of their chambers, even kings may have whispered, just in case. There were those whose names we do not know. The servant who swept the temple floors, the orphan who pressed her cheek to a cold statue, the wanderer who slept beneath a shrine's eaves, hoping for shelter from both wind and wrath. They could not afford offerings, but they made them anyway. A flower plucked, a story recited by heart, a pebble laid gently on a step. Sometimes their prayers were never answered, but still they prayed. And in the eyes of myth, no prayer was too small. The gods did not always grant favor, but perhaps they listened. And so now, the story's slow. The gods, once vibrant in firelight and song, grow quiet again. Not gone, simply waiting. Their temples may be broken, their names faded from prayers, but still they linger, in old marble, in constellations overhead, in the soft tales passed from voice to voice across centuries. The people who once believed, the farmers and rulers, the mothers and artisans, the philosophers and children, they are gone, yet their rhythms remain. The myths were never meant to end. They only sleep, just like you. So if your eyes grow heavy, let them close. Let the olive groves and distant lyres carry you softly into stillness. Let the past wrap around you like a woven cloak, not to bind, but to comfort. And if you feel the hush of ancient breath in the dark, perhaps a god is near, or perhaps it's just the night, remembering. At what time are you listening? Comment below and tell us. This was your narrator, Historian Couch. Plug in your earphones. Keep the distractions away. And rest well. Historian Couch signs off.